There is a kind of intelligence that becomes its own prison, not the intelligence that is absent. That is a different problem entirely. This is the intelligence that is present, genuine, undeniable, the kind that other people notice first, that teachers comment on, that opens doors before you have even decided you want to walk through them. This intelligence feels like a gift. For a while it is, but there is something it does to a person, quietly, over years, that no one warns them about. It teaches them that beginning is enough. Because for the brilliant person, beginning always goes well. The first week of any new subject, any new skill, any new project, the brilliant person moves faster than everyone around them. They understand what others struggle with. They see connections others miss. They receive the early praise that confirms what they already suspected about themselves. And then the territory changes. The early advantage disappears. The subject deepens past the point where natural understanding is sufficient. The skill demands repetition, failure, the grinding, unglamorous work of building what talent alone cannot provide. And the brilliant person, who has never needed to push through that wall before, encounters it for the first time and does not know what it is. They call it lack of interest. They call it a wrong fit. They call it moving on. They do not call it by its true name. Fear, dressed in the clothes of intelligence. The samurai tradition has a word for what is required to dismantle this. Not a technique, not a strategy. A path of complete surrender, of placing everything you believe about yourself on the altar of genuine practice and discovering what remains when the ego has been burned away. They called it Shugyo, and no one in Japanese history walked that path more completely, more painfully, or more transformatively than Yamaoka Testu. This is his story, and the story of a young man in London who was the most gifted person in every room he entered and had nothing to show for it. Who was Yamaoka Tesshū? Before the story, you need to understand who Tesshū was, because his life is not an inspiration, it is a mirror. Yamaoka Tesshū was born in 1836 in Japan, during the final turbulent decades of the samurai era. From his earliest years, he displayed gifts that marked him as exceptional, in swordsmanship, in calligraphy, in Zen study. Those around him recognized immediately that they were in the presence of someone unusual. And Tesshū knew it. That knowing, that early, confirmed, repeatedly validated knowing of his own gifts, became the first obstacle on his path. Not because the gifts were false, they were real, but because real gifts, untempered by genuine struggle, produce a particular kind of arrogance that the person carrying it cannot see from the inside. For 20 years, Tesshū trained in swordsmanship under multiple masters. He was talented. He improved rapidly. He defeated opponents that lesser practitioners could not touch. And yet, something was missing. Something that every master he trained under could see and he could not. His sword was brilliant, but it was not free. Every cut carried the weight of someone watching themselves cut. Every movement contained the ghost of self-assessment. He was never fully inside the practice. Part of him was always outside it, observing, evaluating, confirming. At the age of 45, after decades of training, Tesshū sat in meditation for 7 days without sleep, without adequate food, pushing past every boundary his body and mind believed to be absolute. On the 7th day, something broke open. He described it as the moment his ego finally ran out of places to hide. What remained, when the self-watching finally exhausted itself, was the sword without the swordsman, the cut without the cutter. He called this Muto Ryu, the school of no sword, not the absence of a weapon, the absence of the self that wields it. In the years that followed, Tesshū became something the world rarely produces, not just a master swordsman, though he was perhaps the greatest of his generation, a calligrapher whose work is still considered among the finest in Japanese history, a Zen teacher, and most remarkably, the man sent to negotiate with the commander of the imperial army during the Meiji Restoration, whose conversation prevented the bloodbath that would otherwise have destroyed Tokyo. Not his sword that saved the city, his presence. The quality of a man who had burned away everything that was not essential and stood before another person with nothing to protect and nothing to prove. 6 principles from that burning. 6 ways the ego is dismantled, not by attacking it, but by placing it in contact with reality long enough for it to dissolve on its own. Chapter 1. The smartest person who had nothing. His name was Kofi. Kofi Mensa was 23 years old, and he had been the most gifted person in every room he had ever entered. This was not arrogance. It was simply accurate. His secondary school teachers had said it. His university lecturers had said it. The few employers who had worked with him briefly had said it. Kofi had a mind that moved differently from most. Faster, more associative, capable of grasping the architecture of a new subject within hours of encountering it. He was reading philosophy, economics, and cognitive science simultaneously at a London university, not because his degree required it, but because his mind moved between disciplines the way other people move between rooms. Ideas connected across fields in ways that surprised even his tutors. On paper, Kofi was exceptional. In practice, Kofi had a problem that was becoming impossible to ignore. He had started his dissertation 3 times. 3 different topics, 3 different supervisors, 3 different moments of early brilliance that had produced beautiful opening chapters and then stopped. The university had granted him 2 extensions already. A 3rd was not coming. Before the dissertation, there had been the startup, a technology platform he had conceived at 19 that 2 of his friends were still trying to build from the wreckage of his early departure. He had generated the idea, written the initial framework, secured the first investor meeting, and then found that the day-to-day reality of building the thing was a different country from the country of conceiving it. Before the startup, there had been the novel, 40,000 words written in 6 weeks, then abandoned when the story reached the point where inspiration alone could no longer carry it and craft was required. Before the novel, there had been the music, the coding project, the documentary he had planned to make, the academic paper that was still, 3 years later, an outline. Kofi did not lack ideas. He had more ideas than most people encounter in a lifetime. What Kofi lacked, though he did not yet have the vocabulary for it, was the ability to remain present when the brilliant beginning gave way to the demanding middle. He told himself different stories about each abandoned project. The startup, the market wasn't ready. The novel, it needed more research before continuing. The dissertation, the topic wasn't quite right. The academic paper, he had moved past that interest. Each story was intelligent enough to be convincing. Each story contained enough partial truth to obscure the complete truth. The complete truth was simpler and harder. Kofi believed, at a level beneath his conscious awareness, that his gifts exempted him from the part of mastery that is not gifted at all. The grinding part, the returning to the same page for the 40th time part. the building in public before you are ready part. He had spent 23 years being remarkable in the early stages of things. He had never stayed long enough to discover what came after remarkable. His academic supervisor had told him recently, with a patience that was clearly running out, "Kofi, you are the most intellectually capable student I have supervised in 15 years. You are also the only one who has never submitted anything." He had laughed it off in the room. He had not slept that night. 3 weeks after that conversation, Kofi's younger cousin came to visit him in London from Accra. His cousin was 20, studying engineering, unremarkable by any external measure. Average grades, no particular gifts that anyone had commented on. But he had something Kofi noticed with a discomfort he could not name. His cousin finished things, not brilliantly, not in ways that anyone was celebrating, but consistently, quietly, without drama, he completed what he started. He had been learning Portuguese for 8 months and spoke it badly and kept going. He had been building a small electronics project in his spare time for a year, and it still did not fully work, and he kept going. Kofi watched his cousin work on the electronics project one evening and felt for the first time that his own gifts might be a burden he had mistaken for wings. That same evening, walking back from dinner, they passed a building Kofi had walked past dozens of times without registering. A small sign beside a narrow door. Tesshū Dojo. Zen Swordsmanship and Calligraphy. Established 1987. His cousin stopped. "What is that?" Kofi had no answer, but he wrote down the address. The dojo occupied the upper floor of a Victorian building near London Bridge. It was smaller than Kofi expected and more serious. No decoration that was not functional. Practice weapons on one wall, calligraphy scrolls on another. Not for display, clearly, but as examples of ongoing work. The teacher's name was Sensei Amara. She was 51 years old, British Ghanaian, and had been practicing in the Tesshū tradition for 26 years. She had studied in Japan for 7 of those years under a direct student of Tesshū's lineage. She taught swordsmanship, calligraphy, and what she described simply as sustained attention, the quality of mind that both disciplines required and developed. Kofi explained himself in the way he explained himself to everyone, fluently, intelligently, with the kind of self-awareness that sounds like honesty but contains, he was beginning to realize, a more sophisticated layer of self-protection. He described his projects, his gifts, his pattern of beginning and stopping. Amara listened without expression. When he finished, she said, "Pick up the brush." She placed a sheet of practice paper before him, a brush, ink. She demonstrated a single character, the kanji for one, a single horizontal stroke. "Copy it," she said. Kofi copied it. It was not good, but it was a reasonable first attempt for someone who had never held a calligraphy brush before. Again, he copied it again. By the 5th attempt, Kofi felt the familiar restlessness. He was not improving noticeably. The exercise felt beneath him. He wanted to understand the principles before continuing the repetition. "Can you explain what I should be focusing on? The angle of the brush, or the pressure, or..." Amara stopped him with one word. "Again." Kofi copied the character again, and again, and again. After 30 attempts, his hand was tired, and the characters were no more uniform than at the start. He set the brush down. "I think I need to understand the underlying mechanics before I can improve through repetition. If you could explain the theory of the stroke, I could apply it more." Amara looked at him with an expression that contained no judgment, but also no accommodation. Tesshū, she said, spent 3 years on a single drawing exercise before his master allowed him to move forward. Not because he was slow, because he was exactly like you. He understood everything, and understanding, he believed, was sufficient. His master knew that understanding is the beginning of the journey. Most people mistake it for the destination. She picked up his brush and placed it back in his hand. The character is not the lesson. Your relationship with the character is the lesson. Again. Kofi picked up the brush. He did not fully understand what she meant yet. He would. Principle 1. Shugyo, the voluntary embrace of difficulty. 3 weeks into his practice at the dojo, Kofi arrived one Saturday to find Amara seated with tea and no practice materials on the table. "Sit," she said. He sat. "Tell me what you know about why you stop." Kofi gave his usual intelligent answer. The analysis of his own pattern, the theories about optimal challenge levels, the research he had read about creativity and motivation. Amara let him finish. "That," she said, "is the ego defending itself with the most sophisticated weapon available to it. Your intelligence. You have just given me a complete and accurate description of your problem that contains not a single moment of genuine discomfort." Kofi was quiet. Tesshū understood something that took him 20 years and enormous suffering to learn. The ego does not disappear when challenged directly. It is too clever for that. It transforms the challenge into an intellectual exercise and then evaluates the exercise from a safe distance. You just did it in real time, in front of me. The samurai concept that addresses this is called Shugyo. It is usually translated as austere training or disciplined practice, but the translation loses the essential quality. Shugyo is the deliberate placement of yourself in contact with difficulty that your intelligence cannot resolve. Not difficulty you can think your way through. Difficulty that requires you to simply endure, repeat, and trust the process even when, especially when, you cannot see why. The brush stroke you have been repeating for 3 weeks cannot be understood. It can only be done. That is the point of it. Every time your mind reaches for an explanation, a theory, a framework, and finds none, it is being asked to release its grip slightly. That releasing, repeated thousands of times, is Shugyo. Your gifts, Kofi, have protected you from Shugyo your entire life. Every time a subject became difficult, you moved to a new one where your gifts could operate again. You have been living in the early stages of everything, where intelligence is sufficient, and leaving the moment it no longer is. What Shugyo asks of you is to stay. Not because staying is comfortable, because staying is the only place where the thing you are actually seeking and have never named can be found. Kofi asked without his usual fluency, "What am I seeking?" Amara looked at him steadily. "To find out what you are made of when your gifts are not enough." The neuroscience of the ego's defense. Here the story must pause, because what is happening in Kofi's brain has a name, and understanding it changes the relationship with it. Researchers at Stanford University, led by psychologist Carol Dweck, spent decades studying what happens when highly intelligent people encounter difficulty. Her findings produced one of the most important distinctions in modern psychology: the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. But there is a specific finding within that research that almost no one talks about. People who were consistently praised for their intelligence, not their effort, their intelligence. developed a measurable aversion to challenges that might reveal the limits of that intelligence. Not because they were lazy, because the identity built around being intelligent was threatened by any evidence that intelligence alone was insufficient. The brilliant person does not abandon difficult things because they lack discipline. They abandon them because continuing would produce evidence that contradicts the most important story they tell about themselves. The ego, in this context, is not arrogance in the ordinary sense. It is an identity so thoroughly constructed around a single quality, intelligence, giftedness, natural ability, that it cannot survive contact with the grinding reality of genuine mastery. And here is what neuroscience adds to what Dweck discovered. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for long-term planning and delayed gratification, requires repeated exercise in tolerating discomfort to develop its full capacity. When a person consistently escapes difficulty at the first sign of resistance, the neural pathway between impulse and action shortens. The gap in which a choice could be made narrows until it disappears entirely. The brilliant person who has never needed to push through difficulty has, without knowing it, been training their brain to escape at the exact moment that mastery begins. Neuroscientist Andrew Huberman describes this as the erosion of what he calls the friction tolerance system. The brain learns, through repeated escape, that discomfort is a signal to leave rather than a signal to engage. And once that learning is established, it operates below the level of conscious decision. The person does not choose to leave. They simply find themselves somehow no longer there. Shugyo is the deliberate reversal of that training. Not through willpower. Willpower is insufficient against a conditioned neurological response, but through the design of conditions in which leaving is not an option, and repetition is the only available action. The brush stroke that cannot be understood. The character that must be done again, and again, and again. Principle 2. Mushin, the mind that has released its own opinions. In the second month, something began to shift. Not in the quality of Kofi's calligraphy, though that was slowly, almost invisibly, improving. Something in the quality of his attention. He noticed it first during the brush practice. There were moments, brief, unpredictable, when the internal commentary stopped. When the part of him that was always assessing, comparing, theorizing, went quiet. And in those moments, the brush moved differently. Not better technically, more honestly, as if the character that emerged was no longer filtered through his ideas about what it should be. He described this to Amara one morning. She nodded once, unsurprised. Tesshū called this Mushin, the mind of no mind, not an empty mind, a mind that has released its attachment to its own opinions about what is happening. Your mind, Kofi, has an opinion about everything, about the stroke before you make it, about the stroke while you are making it, about the stroke after it is made. 3 layers of commentary surrounding every single action. That commentary is not helping you. It is the noise your ego makes to remain relevant. Mushin is not the silencing of the mind. It is the exhaustion of the ego's commentary through repetition. You cannot think your way to Mushin. You cannot decide to have it. You repeat the stroke until the commentary runs out of things to say. And then, in that silence, you discover what the stroke actually is when you are not in the way of it. This is why Tesshū's master refused to explain. Explanation feeds the commentary. Repetition exhausts it. Kofi sat with this for a long time. He thought about his dissertation, about the startup, about the novel. He had abandoned all of them at the exact moment they required something he could not think his way through. The moment craft was needed rather than conception. The moment the hands had to do what the mind alone could not. He had called that moment lack of interest, mismatch, moving on. He understood now what it actually was. The commentary had run out of material to work with, and rather than sitting in that silence and discovering what was on the other side of it, he had left. "I have been leaving," he said quietly, at the exact moment I was about to find something. Amara looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That is precisely what you have been doing." Principle 3. Heijoshin. Ordinary mind as the practice. In the third month, Kofi did something he had not done in 4 years. He returned to his dissertation, not with a new topic. The same topic he had abandoned the second time. The relationship between cognitive bias and institutional decision-making. The chapter that had stopped him was the methodology section. Not conceptually difficult, technically demanding in a way that required patience rather than brilliance. He sat down with it on a Tuesday evening and wrote 2 paragraphs. Not good paragraphs, adequate ones. He returned to it on Wednesday. 2 more paragraphs. Thursday, 2 more. He told Amara about this on Saturday. She did not celebrate. She introduced the third concept. Heijoshin, she said, ordinary mind. The samurai concept that the Zen teacher Zanshin described as, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The mind that needs the work to feel extraordinary in order to do it is a mind that has made a hostage of itself. It will only act when the conditions are sufficiently inspiring, and the conditions are almost never sufficiently inspiring. Heijoshin is the practice of treating the work as ordinary, not beneath you, not above you. Simply what needs to be done today, without requiring it to be more than it is. Your gifts have taught you to need the feeling of brilliance in order to work. You have been waiting every time you sit down for the electricity of the beginning. And when it does not arrive, because it cannot arrive every day, it is not designed to. You interpret the absence as a sign that this is not the right work, the right day, the right moment. Heijoshin says, sit down anyway. Write the 2 paragraphs anyway. Not because they will be extraordinary, because they are what today requires. Kofi thought of Itsuki's father in the story he had read once. 4 in the morning, 41 years. Not because he loved waking at 4, because there was work that needed doing and the discomfort was simply the price. He had always read that kind of story as admirable but foreign. Something for people who did not have what he had. He understood now that it was not foreign at all. It was the only path that existed for everyone, regardless of what they had been given at the start. The research that names what Tesshū knew. Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck's research showed something specific about the mechanism of abandonment in gifted people. When students who had been identified as gifted were given tasks that exceeded their current ability, the majority did not increase their effort. They decreased their engagement and, when possible, their participation. Not from laziness. From a calculation so fast it happened below consciousness. If I try and fail, the failure will cost more than not trying. The identity built around giftedness cannot absorb the evidence of limitation, so it avoids the evidence. But Dweck found something else. Something that the channel you are watching has built its entire philosophy around. When those same gifted students were taught to understand struggle as the mechanism of growth rather than evidence of its absence, the pattern reversed. Not immediately, not completely, but measurably and durably. The brain, neuroscientists now understand, is not fixed. The prefrontal cortex continues developing into the mid-20s and retains plasticity throughout life. The neural architecture of persistence, the capacity to return to difficult work without requiring it to feel good, can be built at any age through exactly the kind of deliberate, repetitive, unglamorous practice that Amara was requiring of Kofi. The brushstroke is not about calligraphy. It is about building, one repetition at a time, the neural architecture that giftedness alone never had reason to construct. Principle 4. Zanshin. The attention that does not relax after progress. In the 4th month, Kofi submitted a complete methodology chapter to his supervisor. It was not his best work. It was complete, rigorous, and on time for the first time in 3 years of extensions. His supervisor sent a one-line response. "This is exactly what was needed. Continue." Kofi read that email 6 times. That weekend, he did not go to the dojo. He spent Saturday with friends, celebrating, not explicitly, but in the way people celebrate when something long delayed finally arrives. He was lighter than he had been in years. Sunday, he sat down to continue the dissertation. He could not write a sentence, not because the material was difficult, because the feeling of the email, the completion, the validation, the ending of a specific anxiety, had taken something with it when it left. The urgency was gone, and without urgency, the ordinary mind he had been building felt distant and inaccessible. He went to the dojo on Monday. Amara looked at him as he walked in. "You stopped," she said. It was not a question. "I submitted the chapter. I thought..." "Zanshin," Amara said. "The 4th principle, and the one that defeats more practitioners than all the others combined. In Japanese archery, Kyudo, the archer does not lower the bow when the arrow is released. The posture is held. The attention is maintained. The form continues past the moment of completion. Not because the arrow needs guidance after it has left. It does not. But because the archer who relaxes the moment of release has already, in that relaxation, begun to dismantle what the practice built. Tesshū described this as the most dangerous moment on the path. Not the beginning when everything is difficult, not the middle when everything is grinding, the moment of first success, because the ego, which has been quiet, suppressed by the difficulty, unable to find a foothold, returns at the moment of achievement with a very reasonable argument. You have earned this rest. You have proved the point. You can afford to ease up. And that argument is the most dangerous thing the ego ever says. Because it is almost true. You have worked hard. You have made progress. You do deserve acknowledgement. But the practice is not a project with a completion point. The dissertation is not the practice. The daily return to the work is the practice. The chapter was one arrow. There are hundreds more. The bow must be held. Kofi returned to the dissertation that evening. Not because he felt ready, because the bow must be held. Principle 5. Ichinen, the single concentrated thought. In the 5th month, Kofi's supervisor asked him to present his research in progress at a departmental seminar. 20 academics. A public presentation of incomplete work. Kofi's first response was to find a reason to decline. He named several to himself. The work was not ready. The findings were preliminary. The methodology still had gaps. Each reason was accurate. None of them was the actual reason. He brought this to Amara. "What is the actual reason?" she asked. Long silence. "If I present incomplete work, they will see the gaps, and the gaps will tell them something about me that I don't want them to know." "What will the gaps tell them?" Longer silence. "That I am not as far ahead as they think I should be. That someone with my ability should have produced more by now." Amara was quiet for a moment. "Tesshū," she said, "walked into negotiations with the commander of the Imperial Army during the Meiji Restoration. He was sent to prevent the destruction of Tokyo. He had no weapons. He had no authority. He had only what he was, a man who had spent 20 years burning away everything that was not essential. He sat before the commander and spoke without protection. Not because he was fearless, because he had nothing left to protect. The ego that needed to appear a certain way had been exhausted through Shugyo. What remained was simply a man saying what was true. The commander, who had been prepared for confrontation, encountered instead the quality of someone who was not performing. And that quality, the absence of performance, was what changed the negotiation. Ichinen. Single concentrated thought. Not the management of how you appear, the complete direction of your attention toward the thing itself. What is true, what is needed, what serves the work. Present the seminar. Not as a performance of competence, as a report of what is actually there. The gaps included, the gaps honestly named. The academics in that room have all had gaps. They know what incomplete work looks like from the inside. What they have rarely encountered is someone willing to show it without disguising it. That willingness, that is what Tesshū carried into the negotiation. Not brilliance, honesty. And honesty, when it is complete and unprotected, is more powerful than any performance of capability. Kofi presented the seminar. He named the gaps explicitly. He described where the methodology was still uncertain. He said, "I don't know yet" 3 times in 40 minutes, something he could not remember doing in any academic context in his life. The questions afterwards were the most generative he had experienced, because the academics, encountering genuine work rather than a performance of finished work, could engage with what was actually there rather than what was being presented. His supervisor found him afterwards. "That," she said, "is the most intellectually honest seminar presentation I have seen in this department in 10 years. Principle 6. Muto, the School of No Sword. In the 6th month, Kofi finished the dissertation. Not submitted, finished. The full document, every chapter complete. The conclusion written not from inspiration, but from the slow, patient accumulation of months of ordinary work done ordinarily. He sat in the dojo the Saturday after submission. No brush in his hand, no practice material, just sitting. Amara made tea and sat across from him. "Tell me what you understand now that you did not understand 6 months ago," she said. Kofi thought carefully. The old version of him would have had an answer immediately. Articulate, comprehensive, impressively self-aware. He sat with the question for several minutes before speaking. "I thought my gifts were what I was," he said finally. "I spent 23 years identifying with them. When something required more than they could provide, I left, because staying would have revealed that I was less than what I believed myself to be. Shugyo didn't teach me to work harder. It taught me that the work is not a performance of who I am. It is simply what is needed, and what is needed, I can do, without requiring it to confirm anything about me." Amara nodded slowly. Tesshū called his school Muto Ryu, she said. The school of no sword. Most people understand this as a technique, fighting without a weapon. But Tesshū meant something more fundamental. The sword that the skilled practitioner must ultimately put down is not the steel one. It is the identity, the story of being someone, the need to perform competence, to arrive already formed, to be seen as exceptional before the work has proven anything. Muto, no sword, means arriving empty. No credentials held in front of you. No gifts displayed as protection. No intelligence deployed as armor. Simply a person in contact with the work, doing what is needed. That is the school. Not the absence of skill. You have more skill now than when you arrived. The absence of the need for the skill to make you someone. Kofi sat with that for a long time. He thought about the afternoon he had watched his cousin working on the electronics project that still did not function. The patience of it. The returning without needing the return to be celebrated. He had envied it without understanding what he was envying. He understood now. His cousin had never needed the work to confirm anything about him. He simply did the work. And in doing the work, he became someone who finishes things. Not because he declared it, because he did it. Repeatedly, quietly, without drama. Identity is not what you are given. It is what you consistently do, especially when doing it costs you the story you have been telling about yourself. I want to know, Kofi said, what I am when the gifts are not the answer. Amara looked at him with the first full smile she had offered in 6 months. Now, she said, you are asking the right question. And now, the practice actually begins. What this means for you. Kofi is not an unusual case. He is what happens to intelligence that is never asked to endure. If you have spent years beginning things brilliantly and leaving them before they demanded what brilliance alone cannot provide, this story is your mirror. The 4 principles Tesshū built his life around are not for samurai. They are for anyone who has mistaken their gifts for their identity and discovered, in the quiet aftermath of every abandoned project, that the mistake is costing them something they cannot name. Shugyo. Place yourself in contact with difficulty that your intelligence cannot resolve, not to punish yourself, to discover what exists on the other side of the moment your gifts run out. Mushin. Repeat the work until the commentary exhausts itself. The ego's opinions about the work are not the work. The stroke after the commentary has run out is closer to the truth than any stroke made while you were watching yourself. Heijoshin. Ordinary mind. The work does not need to feel extraordinary to be worth doing. It needs to be done. Today, as what today requires. Without waiting for the electricity of the beginning to return. Zanshin. Hold the bow after the arrow. Progress is not permission to ease up. The practice is not the chapter. The practice is the daily return. The bow must be held. Ichinen. Direct your attention toward what is actually there, not the performance of what you wish were there. Honesty, when it is complete and unprotected, is more powerful than any display of capability. Muto. Put down the sword. Not your skill. Your need for the skill to make you someone. Arrive empty. Do the work. Let what you consistently do, rather than what you have been given, become the answer to the question of who you are. The samurai did not become great by knowing they were exceptional. They became great by continuing after the knowledge was no longer enough. That is the path. It does not require you to abandon your gifts. It requires you to stop hiding behind them. In the comments, what is the project you have been brilliant at beginning and cannot finish? And what would it mean to you specifically to finish it?